all that being said, let's get into my man, Emanuel Augustus, for a second. Absolutely one of my favorite fighters of all time. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A complete showman. One of those guys, I've talked about jobbers a little bit on this show before. And essentially what a jobber is it's somebody who, by no choice or fault of their own, is consistently the B side of the fight, meaning that they're not necessarily expected to win. It could be because their record's already bad. It could be because they're really not that good at fighting. It could be that they don't have any money behind them or any promotion behind them or any real support. And they have to be the B side if they want to stay active and stay getting paid. And to me, and I mean this in a respectful way, because a good jobber, is a talent. This is maybe the greatest jobber of all time. Part of why he's the greatest jobber of all time is because a lot of times with these jobbers, they fight in a very defensive manner because they got to fight again next weekend. And so what they're really good at is survival, a lot of them. They're good at not getting hit. They're good at throwing just enough to keep you off. They're good at keeping space, but they're not necessarily that good at winning. They have good boxing skills that they can use to survive, but not necessarily like a winning strategy. And this Emanuel Augustus guy, also known as the Drunken Master, is somebody who I think from the very beginning of his career would go into all of these fights without a real support system, without a big promoter, without the network praising him as the favorite. It seems like from the very beginning of his career that's something he had to duel with, just being the B side. And I think a lot of times guys who are always on the B side, eventually they grow to accept that role. They grow to accept that I just go 10 tonight and I'm gonna try not to get nicked up too bad. That was not the case with Emanuel Augustus, man. It didn't matter if the guy had 4 losses in a row. It didn't matter if he got stopped his last fight. It didn't matter if you were undefeated and he had more losses than wins. He showed up to win. He showed up to entertain, and he showed up to act like a fighter and to act like a champion. And there's something really kind of special and admirable about that, where, so many of the guys that are successful in boxing have this machine behind them that's pushing them, or, that's helping to keep them on TV, helping to keep them relevant, even if they lose. And somebody like this, all he's got is his skills. He doesn't have those other forms of backing that so many fighters have. All he's got is his fucking skills and his balls and his will to win. And sometimes that's not enough to get you the decision. Sometimes you're a smaller guy. Sometimes you didn't get to train for long enough. Sometimes you train too long and drain weight too much. There's so many different things, and it's an unforgiving sport without that support. Well, it's an unforgiving sport if you have that support system. If you don't have that, it's like the Wild West. You're taking calls for last minute fights, and you're risking everything every time you do it. So, in out of respect for him and just enjoying his whole career and having watched a ton of his fights, I just kind of went through and I picked a handful that, I felt like were really great examples of what kind of guy he was as a fighter. There are so many more big names that he's fought that I'm not even going to touch on today. So if he's somebody you want to learn about, I would go on his box rec. I would go on YouTube and just kind of watch what he does. But, the first one, and I'm just going to go in chronological order. But the first kind of big contender he fought was a guy named Ivan Robinson. And this was in 1996. You may have seen Ivan Robinson and Arturo Gatti fight. And they had 2 absolutely classic wars that are in that Gatti Ward caliber. To give you context, I'm just going to give you the record just so you can get an understanding of just how much the B-side Augustus was. Also, an interesting fact, when he first started his career, he was Emanuel Burton. And about halfway through his career, his parents got married, and he took his father's last name. So he became Emanuel Augustus. So early in his career, this was July 21st, 1996. At 8-5-2, he fought Ivan Robinson, who was 22-0. And I think was obviously outclassed in this fight, but it was just obvious that he wasn't the kind of guy who was just going to walk in and kind of lay down and take it. You know, he wasn't just going to follow the script, if you will. And he was going to be a participant in every fight you put him in. I think you saw that in his fight from 1997 against Dios Bellis Hurtado. At the time, Burton was 11-8-3. Hurtado was 21-1. The one being to Pernell Whitaker in a very, very close fight. You have to keep in mind, you know, these are world-class fighters. So he loses the decision to Robinson, keeps fighting, loses a couple more, and fights Dios Bellis Hurtado. He's got this fucking wild, like, Cat Williams perm, and it's the first time I feel like you really see his swagger. He starts, you know, they call him the Drunken Master for a reason. He'll start dancing around the ring. He'll start jumping off both feet. He'll start, you know, acting like a marionette, and he's got this wild thing about him where it's like, why does this guy with all of these losses fucking with me right now? You know, like, he's not intimidated. He's not on the back foot. He's not running away. He's trying to win. I think that throws a lot of guys off. But, you know, Hurtado had very clean technical skill. Ultimately, I think a lot of times with Augustus fights, the judges weren't entirely watching and were just scoring off of the narrative or off of the record, or if it's a close round, I'm going to give it to the guy with the better record. And there was some of that in this fight. He definitely didn't win it, but it was the first time you saw his swagger and his style and his uniqueness against a world-class fighter. And not soon after that, he would travel to Finland and take on a guy named Soren Sondergaard, who at the time was 38-1. Augustus was 16-12-3. This fight, he dropped Sondergaard twice. He's on the front foot, bringing it to him the whole time, and he gets a draw in a foreign country. I think if you watch this fight, it's pretty obvious that that's not a good decision. And that's sort of the story of his career, is showing up as the B-side, giving more than is expected, and even while giving more than is expected, you know, not really getting credit for that from the judges. And so you see the losses piling up, you know, as he goes along, you know. So he there's a draw in that fight, and then just a few fights later, he takes on an unbeaten guy named Terrell Finger and completely dominates him for 8 rounds and stops him in the 8th round. You know, the announcers are saying they got to stop this fight. Augustus is just beating on him and da-da-da. And I think by then, the boxing world would have had to have kind of bought in on Augustus that, you know, you could bring this guy in, and if your prospect isn't the real deal, you know, he's going to get smoked. This is not a gimme fight. This is not a tune-up kind of fight. This is a guy who is playing by a different set of rules and is just more active than everybody and isn't afraid of his record looking like shit. And speaking of prepared prospects, in October 12th of the year 2000, Emanuel Augustus fought Floyd Mayweather. And I think you'll see multiple interviews where Mayweather says to this day that Emanuel Augustus is the most difficult opponent that he's ever faced. And it was the first time, you know, I'm sure for Floyd that it was the first time that there's somebody that's in his face just like making faces at him and poking fun at him and kind of fucking with him a little bit. Now, Floyd was a much higher class fighter and would stop him in the 9th. But again, this is an example of him coming in as the B-side and just completely over delivering. You know, I think everyone viewed that as a big tune-up for Mayweather, and it turned out to be kind of a rugged fight where, you know, his nose is bleeding, he's taking hard punches, probably some of the hardest punches in his whole career. And, you know, and for Augustus, it was just another night in the office. He was somebody who would just stay so busy. And, with Floyd, he really wasn't afraid to get in his chest and take a couple and make some funny faces at him and do his little marionette puppet moves. And it was kind of a special fight. It was kind of cool to see somebody push Floyd in that way that really was not expected to in any way. Not a world-class fighter. And I think for me, the fight after that really solidifies his legacy is his 10 rounds with Mickey Ward. Now, if you haven't seen this fight, Ward, I think, wins a unanimous decision with some really, really, really bad scorecards. But if you haven't ever seen this fight, it's on YouTube, and I highly recommend that you go watch this one. In my mind, when I think of like the best fights I've ever seen, this is the best fight I've ever seen. The level of action for 10 rounds straight, the pace. A lot of the fight is kind of just Mickey pinning Augustus on the ropes and Augustus sort of punching in between Mickey's shots. And that fight is almost like a fucking movie. I mean, it's just nonstop. They're wailing on each other, and ultimately it's another one of those fights where Augustus, substantially over-delivering and maybe not getting attention from the judges, because you could definitely make the argument that he won this fight by a couple of points, I would say. And there are scorecards in there that are, 7, 8 points. It's ridiculous. It's like they weren't even watching the fight. And I think that's just, there was nobody that could shrug that off better than him. I mean, how many guys get a bad decision and it kind of changes them as fighters? That wasn't the case for him. He could just keep losing over and over again, and it wouldn't seem to affect his approach or, affect his next fight. He had no conscience about that. It's almost like a shooter that's been missing 4 or 5, 6 3-pointers in a row. Great shooters don't have a conscience about that kind of shit, and that's how I look at Augustus. There's no conscience about his last fight. This night is this night, and if you have enough to beat me, good on you. But if not, I'm going to take it to you, and I'm going to make you look silly doing it. And there were stretches of the Mickey fight where he makes Mickey look silly. He makes a miss. He's popping him with huge shots whenever he wants. He's dancing around. And it's truly one of the great non-title fights to ever happen, in my opinion. In a career of those. The next one I watched after that was his fight with Levander Johnson. If you remember Levander Johnson, long time lightweight junior welterweight contender. This fight was outside. It was in 100-degree weather. Obviously at the time Johnson was trying to set himself up for something more significant, and Emanuel Augustus got in the way, because at the end of 10 rounds they announced that it was a draw, and it seemed like that was the right decision. It seemed like Augustus was pressing on the front foot, Johnson kind of working his jab, being smart, if anything, trying to keep it at distance, but just not really being able to, and just Augustus's relentless pressure. He would get draws with these guys that are world-class fighters. And ultimately, somebody like Johnson would move forward, and somebody like Augustus would keep moving laterally, basically. And not too long after that, even after, having that draw in that fight, he stopped a guy named Carlos Wilfredo Vilches, who at the time was 37-1, was one of the top contenders for the IBF. He was in the top 4. Why, I'm not really sure, but he was. And Augustus took him to school and won basically every round, stopped him in the 8th round, and I think really showed his pedigree. It's like if you're faking the funk, if you're a paper champion, this is not the guy to fight. Because if you're not the real deal, that you have no chance with this guy. He will actually make you look silly. And this was one of those performances for him where he really made Vilches look out of his depth, out of his element. and it was a very, very impressive win. And, there was a period after that where he went through a little losing streak, and he lost four or five fights in a row. I think he went 0-4-1 with a draw. And he would come back on July 19th of 2002 and win a completely one-sided decision over Alex Trujillo. And he won the IBF, I believe, the IBF lightweight championship. Not the IBF, the IBA. I'm sorry, the IBA lightweight championship. And I don't think he was really expected to win in any capacity in this one. I think Trujillo at the time was looked at as kind of one notch under elite, and looking for a title shot, looking for that next opportunity. And this fight retired him. I'm pretty sure he quit after this. I'm pretty sure that was it after this fight. That's how frustrating it could be to fight this guy. The guys would just stop fighting. They would just stop boxing. And this was one of those examples. Again, Trujillo was 23-1. Augustus at the time 27-23-6, and just absolutely schooled him. Trujillo really never got in a rhythm. He never got off. He could never get working regularly. He couldn't land, and by the time Augustus got dancing and grooving and doing his thing, it was like one-sided fight. He's already going downhill, and you're fucked. And in typical Augustus fashion, he would lose his next fight by disqualification against somebody he was beating. The fighter's name was Tomas Barrientos. And apparently what happened, based on reading the box rec, is that referee Lawrence Cole, my least favorite referee in boxing, said that Augustus was unresponsive in some way, or wasn't looking at him, or had cursed at him, or was just not being particularly compliant, and was winning the fight, and Cole disqualified him. And he followed that up with a 10-round decision loss to Courtney Burton, and that's arguably the worst decision I've ever seen. And I remember watching it, and Teddy Atlas is screaming about, how there needs to be an investigation of the judges, and this is unacceptable, and talking to the commission, and it was just such a mess, and it was so obvious that he had beaten Courtney Burton. It was so obvious what had happened, and it was a relatively one-sided fight, and it was also a fight where he had a point deducted for showboating. A lot of times I think judges and referees just did not like how he carried himself. They didn't like that he was clowning. They didn't like that he was not super serious about everything, because ultimately I think for him, being an entertainer was more important than winning, good or bad. I just think that was his priority, and so, and I think he would, he would psych himself up. He would get into his own little rhythm and get in his own head and get hyped up, and unfortunately, this was a fight that he completely dominated, and at the time, Burton was a top 10 contender. This would have done a lot for his career, and he didn't get the decision, and it was another horrible decision in a career filled with horrible decisions. And, that was a tough one. That was a tough fight right there. A few months, actually about a year later, in July of 2005, he stopped a longtime contender named Ray Oliveira, and I believe he retired him as well. Oliveira, was a top 10 guy at 140 for years prior to that. And I think the thinking was that Oliveira would kind of just ultimately be too consistent for somebody like Augustus. And, he completely outclassed him. It's the most dancing he did in his whole career. It was beautiful to watch, man, honestly. And what wasn't beautiful to watch was, I remember at the end of the fight, Oliveira having some sort of head pain, and them having to stop the fight, and him sort of yelling in the corner, and not being comfortable after the fight. So that part wasn't that great, but the performance from Augustus of just being vintage showman, dominant Emanuel Augustus, that's probably one of his best boxing performances and most consistent performances. And the last one that I thought mattered was eventually in September of 2006, Augustus would get a rematch with Courtney Burton and would win by stoppage in the 8th round. Basically wins every round, has short pockets where he's sort of, not letting his hands go enough as he could do sometimes. But ultimately, I think this fight was sort of like the vengeance fight for him, of being able to right that wrong and being able to really show, like, I am a better fighter than this guy. I'm at a different level than this guy, and I'm not gonna let the judges have a say in how this goes. And even if Burton was like a little bit faded by then, it was a great win for Augustus. And I think, he had some more fights down the stretch of his career. He would lose his last 4 or 5, but ultimately for me, I think this was the fight where he kind of redeemed himself and, at least righted the wrong of that fight. And, I remember seeing it in context and him feel, you could see that was a super rewarding win for him. And, later in his career, he would fight some really tough guys, one of them being Ruslan Provodnikov. And unfortunately, after he retired, he probably retired a few fights too late. And I believe he was in a car accident later in his life a few years ago. And he's recovered. He's alive. I'm not sure that all of his faculties are still fully intact. But hopefully one day I'll be able to fucking talk to him myself and we'll find out. Until that time, he's one of my favorite fighters, and I really just wanted to take this episode to, show my appreciation, maybe walk you through some of the history and some of the fights that this guy went through, and just give you a sense of what a warrior he was, man. There's really not anybody like this guy anymore. There aren't a lot of successful journeymen like this, because the record is so important, because having the 0 at the end of the record is so important, having a big promoter is so important, having a TV deal is so important. It's so hard to be a road warrior like this guy in any era. And so I think that he's worth appreciating, and he's probably one of the best fighters that you haven't ever seen, if you haven't seen him. So if you can, maybe go through all the fights I talked about and take a look at some of them, and, I hope you share my appreciation for somebody that, in my young boxing life was one of the great entertainers of his era. So